David Lawrence was a 50-year-old man who had spent his entire life working hard, pushing through the obstacles that life constantly threw his way. A father of two and a devoted husband, he prided himself on his work ethic, his calm demeanor, and his unshakable belief in fairness. For over 25 years, he had built a respectable career as an operations manager at a large logistics company. It was a tough, demanding job, but David had always approached it with discipline and professionalism. He was one of the first black managers in the company's history. When he'd gotten the promotion 2 decades ago, it had been a major achievement, not just for him but for his community. His family had celebrated the milestone, and David had felt like he had broken through an invisible ceiling. Little did he know that this ceiling would have many more layers, some more visible than others. Over time, David became known for his leadership, his ability to manage crises, and his firm but compassionate approach. He always took care of his team, making sure they were heard and that their contributions were recognized. But beneath the surface, the racial undertones of the workplace, subtle at first, became impossible to ignore. David was not blind to it. The long silences in meetings after he made a suggestion, the way he was passed over for projects he was more than qualified for, often with vague explanations. The colleagues who would speak over him, dismiss his input, and then later present his ideas as their own. He had heard the occasional muttered comments, the quiet assumptions, and the times people seemed to be sizing him up as if they couldn't believe he'd made it this far. But David was used to enduring. He had been taught by his father that life wasn't going to be fair, especially for black men like him. So he swallowed his pride and kept going, hoping that his work would eventually speak louder than the discrimination he faced. One Friday afternoon, an opportunity presented itself that David believed would finally allow him to break free from the glass walls that had boxed him in. The company was restructuring and opening up new divisions, and they were looking for a senior executive to lead the project. It was a perfect fit for David's experience and skills. It felt like his moment had come. David spent the weekend meticulously preparing for the interview. His wife, Karen, saw the excitement and hope in his eyes, though she also knew how many times he had come home disappointed, his efforts dismissed. But she encouraged him, reminding him of his worth. His 2 children, both in college now, called to wish him luck. On Monday morning, David walked into the office, armed with confidence, a binder full of reports, and a presentation ready to show why he was the best person for the job. He knew the other candidates, but none had his experience or his deep understanding of the company. As he sat in the waiting room, he overheard bits and pieces of conversation from the hiring committee, one of which made his heart sink. "We need someone with a strong cultural fit," someone had said. David knew what that often meant. He tried to brush it off and refocused on the task at hand. The interview started well. David presented his case flawlessly. The questions came, and he answered them with precision and thoughtfulness. He felt that familiar buzz of energy, the same one that had carried him through difficult projects and leadership challenges over the years. But halfway through, he noticed a shift in the room. The panel's body language grew distant, their eyes glazing over, as if they had already made their decision. Despite his best efforts, David felt that invisible barrier once again, the one that told him he was being judged by something other than his qualifications. A week later, the news came that the position had gone to someone else. A younger, less experienced white colleague had been chosen. The official reason was that this colleague had fresh ideas and fit the culture better. It was the same vague language David had heard before, and it was a familiar sting. That evening, David sat quietly in his home office, his rejection letter crumpled in his hand. He replayed the events over and over in his mind, but he knew deep down what had happened. Karen entered the room, sensing his despair. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her silent support speaking louder than words. "I don't know what else I could have done," David finally said, his voice heavy with frustration. Karen sat beside him, her eyes filled with understanding. "It's not about what you could have done better. It's about what they refused to see," she said softly. "This isn't about you. It's about them." David nodded, though the weight of the disappointment still lingered. "I thought things would be different by now," he murmured. "After all these years, after all this work, and it's still the same." The next day, David returned to work, his spirits low but his resolve unshaken. As the day wore on, he found himself in the break room, talking with a younger black colleague, Marcus. Marcus had been with the company for only 2 years and had recently encountered his own experience of subtle but unmistakable discrimination. He was hesitant to bring it up, unsure if it was all in his head. "I don't want to come across as the angry black guy," Marcus said quietly, looking around to make sure no one else was listening. "But it's getting hard to ignore." David listened intently, his heart heavy but his mind racing. He realized at that moment that this wasn't just his battle. It was bigger than he. It was about every black person in that company who had felt overlooked, dismissed, or diminished because of the color of their skin. David began to speak up, not just for himself, but for Marcus and for the others who had experienced the same treatment in silence. He gathered a group of colleagues, black, white, and others who shared his vision of a more inclusive workplace. Together, they started raising awareness, pushing for changes in the company's hiring practices, and demanding accountability from the leadership. It wasn't easy. The road was long, and there were setbacks along the way. Some of his colleagues were resistant to change, while others were outright dismissive. But David and his group persisted. They organized workshops, held open discussions, and brought in diversity and inclusion experts to educate the workforce. Slowly, the culture began to shift. The company introduced new policies to ensure fair hiring practices, and upper management was held to higher standards when it came to diversity. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. David's story wasn't just about one man's struggle against discrimination. It became a story of a collective fight for justice and equality in the workplace. David's journey was far from over, but he had sparked a movement that would continue long after he retired. His legacy would be the change he helped bring to the company, not just for himself, but for the future generations of black professionals who would walk through those doors. In the end, David learned that change doesn't always come quickly, and it doesn't always come easily. But with perseverance, courage, and a willingness to stand up for what's right, it's possible to make a lasting difference.